We're here today at the project site of North Shore at Mandalay, which is at the corner of 5th Street and Harbor Boulevard, and it is formerly the site of J&J Oil Disposal Company, and it became a toxic waste site and is now scheduled for residential development. J&J Oil Company operated a waste disposal site here that became classified as a toxic waste site that was closed down in 1981. And today we have Supervisor and former Coastal Commissioner John Flynn. Welcome to the program, John.
Thank you.
You were a Ventura County Supervisor from the year 1972?
That's right, 72.
And you served how long?
32 years.
You were also on the Coastal Commission during its early years?
Coastal Commission appointed by Governor Jerry Brown, 1981, and I served until about 83.
That's great. And the site we're at today was within the county jurisdiction.
Yes.
When you became supervisor.
That's correct.
It had a company called J&J, and there was another company?
There was another company some time ago. I can't remember the name of it. I think it was Connor or something, a name similar to that. And they turned over the operation of their portion. It was about 35 acres to J&J, or John T. Amar was his name, the operator, the final operator.
So both companies were in the waste disposal business?
That's correct, yes.
And so you got to see what they were actually doing down here.
Well, I got to see it. I used to observe trucks dumping waste right behind me here. Then the people from Oxnard Shores, which is right over here, and the mobile home park called me and said, we'd like you to help us close this down. One of the main leaders was a guy by the name of Bob Coulier. I wanted to mention his name because he was so persistent. He passed away some time ago, but he helped me a great deal in getting it closed. But there wasn't really much support for closing it. It was owned by the McGrath family, the site itself. They finally sold it in 1985. And it's a prominent family, well-liked family. But the site simply wasn't something you would have here at the beach area, dumping oil waste and maybe other chemicals too.
You said before that fellow supervisors were not supportive of closing the site, but you still managed to affect their operation. How did you do that?
Well, I think it came to a hearing at the board in 1981, and I had not been on the board for too much into that term, but had worked hard with the county staff, and they put a lot of conditions on it. But when the hearing came, I put more conditions on, operating conditions. And according to what I've read since then, the owner, J&J Oil Waste Facility, had to close it down, did not accept the permit because he said it would be too expensive to operate with all the conditions. Plus, I think he had a few financial problems at that time, but I'm not sure about that.
So did you get any help from the state back in those days?
No, not really. There wasn't much help coming from anywhere. The Oxnard City Council, I did not get help from them. The planning department director, Gene Hosford, was concerned about the site and wanted it only open for a limited amount of time, as I recall. However, it really didn't have any strong opposition, except for myself. I stood out alone on the issue, really.
Well, that's why you're here.
Yeah.
You were the leader in getting the site to close, and there are residents over here that to this day are still concerned about the activity that's going on here.
Well, there is some activity going on. There is a developer that came in and bought the property. I don't know, it's probably changed hands over the years, but lots of conditions were placed on it to put homes here. I'm not sure that's ever been a very good idea, but however, they did take out a lot of waste. I don't know how much or whether they got it all out. I don't know that for sure. They may have, and that needs to be determined. But I think the LA Regional Water Quality Control Board issued a comment in 1985, long after J&J gave up the permit, that it had to be closed properly. And J&J fought that in court, and he lost that one. LA Regional Water won that fight. However, along come some developers, and perhaps that eased the closing requirements.
John, there's a sign here at the site that has a phone number and informs people that if they have a problem with dust or smells that they can call this number. And my understanding is back in the time you were working with the site that there were complaints about smells that were similar to hydrogen sulfide that came from the site.
There were complaints about odors coming from the site. Also, there was some speculation that people later suffered from cancer. However, I don't know anything about that or whether or not that's true from the site being here. However, in anyone's estimation, it was an operation that should never have existed here. The day it was put in here in '54, people didn't have the concern they had later on about environmental issues, and today it would never even pass any kind of mark to become a site again. So it shows how much things have changed since 1954, people's attitude and knowledge of things. People had no knowledge of dumping chemicals here and what impact it would have in those days.
During the permitting process for the residential development, there was some discussion that aside from the oil waste that was dumped here, that there may have been parties bringing in other items that deposited PCBs and PBBs. Was there any knowledge of that back in the 70s?
Certainly, there was speculation, and I think it had a heck of a lot of truth to it, because in those days people didn't particularly care about where they dumped things. There were probably chemicals and toxic materials dumped in the site, that's for sure. The county planning staff found a lot of metals in the site in their testing of it. So it certainly invited anyone and everyone to dump there. I'm pretty sure of that.
John, do you know of any fines that were issued for illegal dumping on the site?
I don't think there were any fines. In fact, in those days, we're talking about 40, 50 years ago, regulations were not enforced very well. And the conditional use permit came about, in the last 35 years, and they weren't really enforced very well in those days. So I don't think any fines were levied.
I know there was some discussion more recently that old electrical transformers may have been dumped here. Was there any knowledge of that back in your time?
There was knowledge of it, however, it's been so long ago I can't remember the particulars. We're talking about 30, in my involvement, 30-some years ago.
Well,
I was only a young man then, and now look at me.
Well, you have a great memory of what transpired back then.
Yeah.
More recently, there's also been discussion that some of the chemicals that were deposited on this site were very close to reaching a local aquifer here, and that was one of the incentives for allowing the work to go forward here. Was there any discussion about local aquifers years ago?
Certainly there was, but there wasn't a knowledge about aquifers that came about a little bit later. As you know, I led the battle against the seawater intrusion in the Oxnard aquifer. The Oxnard aquifer is about 200 feet below us here, and it's an aquifer used by agriculture and urban areas, and so it certainly was threatened.
Well, during the time you were on the board, it was well known that you were the authority on water issues in Ventura County, so your input into this must have been important.
Well, I think you're giving me a lot of credit, which I'll accept, but I think people listen to it. I think you're right.
So, John, it appears that the main reason the site eventually was shut down was due to community concerns, health concerns, and also complaints about odors emanating from the site. Does that coincide with your knowledge?
Certainly there was that. There wasn't, in my recollection, however, there was that for sure. There's no taking away from that. However, it wasn't really that strong. Except from a few people, and I mentioned the name of one of them, and he was absolutely ballistic about this whole thing. When you look over here and you see trucks dumping what could be any kind of material, toxic material, it certainly alarmed people.
Do you think the lack of response was due to the era we're talking about? Were people less inclined to complain about these things?
I think that has a lot to do with it. I think you're absolutely right. In those days, this was more of an agricultural area than it is today. And people simply didn't pay much attention to where they dumped things and so forth. That's all of us. Every one of us is really kind of guilty of that.
Well, the location here is not isolated as a dump site. We're close to Oxnard Shores, which was also a dump site. There's the Halico industrial site, kind of on the other side of town, that's also down by wetlands.
Yeah.
That was apparently a dump site before it was Halico.
Yeah.
So it appears that sand dunes and wetlands were not really valued in those days.
That's correct. I would agree with that. Plus, Oxnard seemed to be a dumping ground for the entire county, too. There are a lot of dumps here. We'll call them dumps now. They're called landfills, sanitary landfills today, but there really were dumps. Everything went into them, starting from here and going up into where the Oxnard Golf Course is today. That was all a dump at one time.
John, this site is now being called North Shore. It's a residential development. And even though it was a toxic waste site, yes, it was annexed into the city of Oxnard, yeah, so that this project could be approved. And doesn't that seem unusual that a city would annex a toxic waste site to deal with those kind of problems?
It does seem very unusual. Of course, they did it some time ago. However, today, for a purchaser of a home here, I would be very reluctant to buy a home on this site, even though there would have been and there has been a good effort to clean out the dirty stuff. I made a presentation at the board that probably lasted an hour. I was pretty well prepared on the issue.
And what did you say to the board?
I asked the board to shut it down. The board was reluctant to do so, as it is to shut any landfill down. It's always, controversial, at least today it is. But putting conditions on certainly made it financially not a good investment.
John Flynn, you were a supervisor how many years?
32 years.
32 years. I think that's the record in Ventura, isn't it?
Tied for the record. The other 32-year person his last name was Clark. He was from Ojai.
Well, John, you've been recognized as a coastal hero for your time on the Coastal Commission, one of the state's leading experts on water and water quality, and you served 32 years on the Board of Supervisors. Many of us want to thank you for your service, which has been outstanding. Everyone knows that you're a great county supervisor, and you had an effect on shutting this place down before it got much worse. So we all thank you.
Thank you very much for the interview, and thanks for your nice comments.
Well, you just heard one of the leading experts on this site and the toxics that were deposited here, questioning the wisdom of purchasing a home on this location. And thanks to John Flynn for speaking to us. I'm Al Sanders for Surf and River Report. Thank you. We're here at Fifton Harbor, which is close to the site of a proposed peaker plant to be built by Southern California Edison, adjacent to the power plant we see over my shoulder. We're very fortunate to have today an expert on this issue, Mike DeMartino, also a local resident.
Hi, Al. How you doing this afternoon?
Doing good. You've been involved in trying to stop this peaker plant for several years now. Why did you become involved in this issue?
Well, it was about 2005, 2006 when this plant was initially proposed, and it was around the time that they were also trying to put an LNG facility off the coast, and the environmental movement was booming at the time. There was a coalition of individuals from all different stripes, from the conservative, liberal, Greens, and different kinds of groups in town and in the county. We had people as far away as Malibu and Santa Barbara involved in that project, and in that process we were also involved in preventing this peaker plant. And what we found at the time was that the peaker plant was basically approved by the city before anybody really had any chance to talk about it. It was there was not an environmental impact report done on it or anything, and people were just left to play catch up from that point.
Mike, Oxnard City planners really gave Southern California Edison a green light, but eventually this went before the City Council, and you did have some success.
Yes, we did, and we were able to get the City Council to deny the permitting for the project here, which was a great thing for the community.
That was the good news, but it was followed shortly with bad news at the California Coastal Commission, I'm told.
Right. The California Coastal Commission, which at the time, many of the members were appointed by our past governor, Arnold Schwarzenegger, were individuals that seemed to think that business interests were more important than the community interests. So I was actually out at the site one day when the whole Coastal Commission came out on a bus and went over to the site, and I was standing there listening to Peter Douglas ask questions like, well, how tall is the smokestack going to be? And they were talking, well, it would be like two buses stacked up on each other standing up straight. But what they didn't talk about was, well, how much more smoke is going to be going up in the air from the top of that? So how high does the smoke go? So they weren't even considering what the environmental impact was. They were just worried about the cosmetics of it. And a lot of what they were talking about, and if you looked at the proposal, was a lot of greens around it to hide it. But it's still a power plant that uses old technology. It's fossil fuels going into our atmosphere. And it's not doing anything to address the problems we have with climate change.
Mike, right behind us is another electrical generating facility. It's called the Mandalay Power Plant. And there's another plant here in the city of Oxnard, the Ormond Generating Station. So this would be the third electrical producing facility in the city of Oxnard. How do local residents feel about having all these electrical generating stations close to them?
Well, we want them gone. I mean, the plants that are here right now were built in the 1950s. They were placed here because at the time they needed cooling from the ocean, but that technology is ancient. We need to go to newer types of power resources. So we're trying to get rid of those two power plants, and now here comes Edison wanting to stick a peaker plant in an area where we're trying to get rid of a plant. So that's how the residents here feel. We don't want these plants here. And in addition, there's a peaker plant, or actually it runs full time over at Procter & Gamble. So we have actually 4 power plants. Would have 4 power plants that I know of running in the area.
You mentioned pollution before. My understanding is this part of Ventura County is a non-attainment area as far as air quality, meaning that we're polluting more than we're allowed to pollute, and you have these 2 generating facilities adding to that. Why do people put up with that?
Well, people don't want to put up with it, and I can tell you, as a cancer survivor, I recently had, in the last year, I had surgery for lung cancer. I don't want to be around these polluting sources. As it is, we have a major freeway running through here. We have agriculture. We have the 2 power plants. And not only that, one of the major sources of pollution coming into our county is from the container ships that run through the channel out here. They use bunker fuel, which is the filthiest, dirtiest fuel you can use. And if you were to ride behind one of these tankers out there, you see all this brown sulfur coming off of these ships. And that drifts into our community here. And so it's one of the largest sources of pollution in Ventura County. So we are bombarded, as you think, well, we're out by the ocean, it's better here, but we're bombarded by industrial pollution. And depending on which way the wind's blowing, we're always going to be affected by this pollution.
Mike, thank you very much for appearing on camera with us today.
Thanks, Al. Appreciate it.
With all we learned today about peaker power, solar energy, and batteries, perhaps the day will come when we will not have the Mandalay Power Plant. For the Surf and River Report, I'm Al Sanders in front of the Mandalay Generating Station.